Today, with the country upended as the U.S. and other international forces leave, both the future of their climbing and of their country is uncertain.
This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. After 20 years, America's longest war is coming to an end. U.S. NATO forces are withdrawing from Afghanistan. That's set to wrap up August 30th, with September 11th planned as a symbolic final deadline. The U.S. has exhausted billions of dollars and spent years training the Afghan military to fight against Taliban insurgents. But some experts have categorized the withdrawal process, initiated by the Trump administration and continued under President Biden, as abrupt and messy. With about 95% of U.S. troops removed, the Taliban have already quickly seized territory across Afghanistan. More than 10 provincial capitals fell within the last week. While the Afghan government still has a tenuous hold on Kabul, the country's capital, EU officials estimate this week that the Taliban controlled at least 65% of the country. That's the largest portion of the country that Taliban has controlled since the regime was toppled by the US invasion in 2001. Despite this rapidly deteriorating situation, the president said this week that he stands by the decision to end America's on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan.
Afghan leaders have to come together. We lost death and injury, thousands of American personnel. They've got to fight for themselves.
Life is changing for all Afghans, but power shifts within the country have always disproportionately impacted Afghan women and girls. So what's next for this half of the population? Human rights advocates say they face two major threats.
We have sort of two kinds of very serious problems. One is just what the Taliban are doing is they take over areas and restricting what had been, where women had been able to enjoy more rights and freedom. And the other is that the fighting itself is taking a terrible toll on civilians, and that's fighting by all sides.
Let's break down that first point. During the Taliban's rule in the 1990s, women were segregated from public life. They were banned from school, voting, and almost all work. Once the Taliban lost power in 2001, harmful gender norms still made it difficult and dangerous for many women in Afghanistan to seek out and travel to school and work. But with these activities no longer prohibited by the ruling party, significant advancements were made. By 2003, 2.4 million girls were enrolled in school. This year, that number is up to 3.5 million. Compare that to 9,000 back in 1999, none of whom advanced past secondary school. Today, Afghan women are doctors, journalists, athletes, politicians, and members of the military. Now, that hard-won progress is threatened by the Taliban's offensive. In public statements, the present-day Taliban have claimed they support women's education as long as they follow Islamic injunctions. In reality, almost all Taliban-controlled districts prohibit girls from attending school after they reach puberty. So far this year, insurgent groups have targeted and killed schoolgirls, and non-state actors from the Taliban have assassinated female journalists, health workers, and politicians. With their fundamental rights in jeopardy, many women in Afghanistan are most concerned with just survival. Over the last 20 years of conflict, nearly 80,000 civilians have been killed in Afghanistan. This year, the death toll in the country reached a new peak. Halfway through 2021, there have already been 1,659 civilians killed, according to the United Nations mission in Afghanistan. That's nearly 50% higher than those killed in the same period from the previous year, and is the highest recorded number since the UN began keeping track in 2009. Now there are concerns that these numbers will continue to climb due to the changing nature of the fighting. During June and July of this year, the Taliban advanced through most rural areas. UN officials say their current trajectory through city centers poses a greater humanitarian risk.
This is now a different kind of war, reminiscent of Syria recently, or Sarajevo in the not-so-distant past. To attack urban areas is to knowingly inflict enormous harm and cause massive civilian casualties.
So here with us to talk a bit more about the Taliban's expanding reach across Afghanistan is Newsy's Sasha Ingber. Sasha, what is the situation in Afghanistan right now?
Well, it's estimated that the Taliban now control about 2/3 of the country. And their old strategy of rural insurgency is working. They have essentially swept across rural areas, and now they're moving on to cities. And some of them have geopolitical and economic importance. And in the north, Kunduz, which is very populated, and I'm told gives the Taliban a straight shot to Kabul. Now, they've been crisscrossing the country, and as you can see in this map, they're also kind of surrounding Kabul to the north and to the southwest. And estimates for when the country could collapse have sped up, going from months to, in some cases, a matter of weeks. Now, what does that mean on the ground? How does it feel for people who are there right now experiencing this? It's a fear, there's desperation, there's panic, there's thousands of people who are fleeing, there are staggering civilian casualties, humanitarian organizations speaking out, prisons where the Taliban have targeted them, trying to release people, fears that girls are going to be forced to marry the Taliban, all of this chaos. Meanwhile, spanning out just a little bit here, Christian, in Doha, the peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban have stalled because the Taliban don't see a need to negotiate right now. And in the United States, service members here tell me that they are questioning why they were even sent to Afghanistan and feel quite demoralized about it. At the same time, Biden says this week that he doesn't regret the decision.
Newsy's Sasha Ingber with more information about what's happening on the ground. Sasha, thank you so much. As the situation on the ground in Afghanistan changes, many Afghan women are determined not to give up the opportunities they fought so hard to realize. Newsy's Meg Hilling spoke to female athletes in the country about their future.
Just a few years ago, one of the biggest concerns for rock climbers with Ascend in Afghanistan was not slipping. Today, with the country upended as the U.S. and other international forces leave, both the future of their climbing and of their country is uncertain.
I think for any young woman coming up now, the picture of what the future holds is not promising at all.
As Taliban and Afghan forces battle for control of the country, Afghanistan's female athletes and the organizations who support them are bracing for what could come, including a return to oppressive measures against women.
This year is more about security, that I cannot go to the mountain. I cannot climb. I cannot be in the tent. I miss the climbing clothes. And these are not easy to accept.
The voice you're hearing is one of two young Afghan women with Ascend, a leadership organization that works with young women in Afghanistan through climbing. They agreed to speak with Newsy on the condition their faces are not shown and they're not named for their safety.
They have grown up in a time where there was a security bubble provided. And if that gets taken away, as it has been, are we really going to leave them to their own fate?
With mounting security concerns, organizations like Ascend are working carefully to balance the safety of the women they serve with their determination to remain active.
We're a leadership program that uses mountaineering, and if there was ever a time to lead, it's now when there's crisis after crisis.
Since 2014, Ascend has been working with young women in Kabul to develop physical and mental strength through exercise, rock climbing, wilderness training, and team building activities.
So now we have a 4-story building that can accommodate 75 girls at a time. And that's how many we have now, full-time, coming through 6 days a week.
Climbing is a very different sport. When we're climbing the mountain, we're free, and we feel that like a bird that won't fly. Because in our society, we have a lot of problems, but in the mountain, we can be far from the city, far from the problems.
Ascend, like so many programs, are hopeful that the changes in mindset they've been able to generate when it comes to women participating in sports will remain firmly rooted in Afghanistan.
Our family, they are supporting me. They are happy. They believe me. Our daughter is strong now.
The coolest thing is when the parents are coming up and saying, I want my daughter to be like one of your leaders in the team because she's cool, she's strong. I want my daughter to be like that.
But these athletes will need help from abroad.
My biggest fear actually is disengagement. And that's what I hear repeatedly from activists on the ground, from women's rights groups saying, don't walk away. Don't just wash your hands of this. We need you now more than ever.
I just don't think that people are going to accept a vision of Afghanistan the way the Taliban see it. It's not that simple. We're not leaving until somebody comes to our building and forces us out. We're not leaving.
For Newsy, I'm Meg Hilling.
Here to talk to us a bit more about the story you just saw is Newsy's Meg Hilling. Meg, first and foremost, thanks for joining us on ITL. In the story, there are two Afghan women who are climbers, and we don't know who they are. Their faces are obscured, their names are withheld. I'm curious to know, what went into that decision.
Thank you for having me, Christian. When I was initially arranging the interview with these two climbers, they were very excited about, being on camera, sharing their names with us. But in light of recent events with the Taliban and the control they're gaining in the country, there is some serious safety concerns. And so these two climbers requested that their names and faces are not shown in our story out of fear of retaliation. In recent weeks, there's been a lot of reports about different NGOs, different women's groups, organizations receiving threats and being retaliated against by the Taliban for kind of speaking out against them and speaking out against their actions. Now, the last thing these girls would want is for their, for their lives, for their families' lives, or for the safety of the organizations that they're working with to come under threat.
I'm wondering, what happens now that the U.S. is pulling out or has been pulling out of Afghanistan after 2 decades? What's next for these women?
That's the thing. It's not really clear what is next for these women. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding what will come for the country, what will come for these organizations, what will come for these women in their day-to-day lives. Since the U.S. began withdrawing from the country, there's been a drop of engagement. And as Patricia Gossman with Human Rights Watch really drove home in the story, the last thing Afghanistan needs right now is a continued declining engagement. And now engagement doesn't just mean funding, it also means having conversations, being covered, being spoken about. And so really at this point in time, these organizations, these athletes are really hoping that the world continues to pay attention to them and talks about them and does what they can to help them continue what they're doing, which is, be athletes.
What's the vibe like for these women who are athletes, considering they've put in so much work? I mean, how is it that they're feeling about, where Afghanistan is right now and what the future looks like for women in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so despite all the uncertainty surrounding the country and the lives of these women at this point in time, they're all really fired up. I mean, you look at kids, athletes, anywhere in the world, everyone's really passionate about sports. And the same goes for folks in Afghanistan. These female athletes really want to continue to participate in their sports, really want to continue to grow and ultimately get to a point where they can compete nationally and compete internationally. So the passion is there. It's just a question of how do we continue to support these groups and these athletes, and how do we help them ultimately grow?
We're going to continue to follow what's happening in Afghanistan because if you've been following along, you'll know the situation there is pretty fluid. In the meantime, we're shifting our focus to COVID-19. When you're back, we'll head to the UK to see just how the Delta variant could impact the upcoming school year.
Donna. Hello. I just feel weightless.
Wow. Welcome to the virtual world.
Thanks, Donna.